Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Nationalist Academy. There's been a lot of podcasts out there, and as many of you know and listen to our podcast, this is under the Woke Folk Network. We have many such podcasts, of course, as the Woke Folk and the Big Ten podcast. This podcast specifically is for philosophy and political philosophy specifically. You can consider this podcast to be kind of your library of sorts. We can occasionally have guests if they're, particularly interesting or particularly well read in a specific thing. Every single week, our plan is to each read a book and give it a general review. We're not going to give it a completely objective review, as in that you can find on many such places that, you should read this book, you shouldn't read this book. We're going to assume that the books we pick are most likely worthwhile to read, and we're going to actually discuss whether the books are right or wrong, how they relate to the right, how they relate to nationalism, and so on and so forth. So starting off, I would like to just get my political philosophy out of the way. I consider myself part of the alt-right. I'm a nationalist libertarian. Our hosts, by the way, are Thomas with us, and also Uber is supposed to be with us, but he is having a night on the town with his wife. Hopefully in the second episode we can get him in to just give a general label to his political ideology. But Thomas, why don't you tell us what your political leaning is?
Well, that's actually a great question. I would consider myself a nationalist populist with some libertarian leaning.
That's very true, and I often have to qualify this because when I say nationalist libertarian, it's not libertarian in the sense that that like a classical liberal or even like somewhat closer to a Ron Paul libertarian, but the basic idea with it is that I always often explain is America is not like Germany whatsoever. If you try to just copy and paste German National Socialism onto America, it simply wouldn't work. We're just too big, and our economy would, just by the very nature of having such a large both consumer base and resource production, it's just not feasible to have a National Socialist system. Therefore, I say it's nationalist libertarianism is basically American National Socialism with domestic capitalism. When people make these complaints against capitalism, they're usually in just two schools, either against international capitalism, which I also disagree with, and also in the kind of realm for the second category is kind of a mistake for materialism being a moral system to follow by, which it isn't. Yes, capitalism is materialistic, but it's mainly a tool to deal with these with these material resources, and not really a good framework to, impose or utilize your, moral and general ethical imperatives that you follow. So, as stated before, we are going to do general book reviews. My book review for the very first episode of this is The Metaphysics of War, Battle, Victory, and Death in the World of Tradition by Julius Evola. Thomas, what book did you pick?
I chose Joseph Conrad's excellent novel, Heart of Darkness, and I might note that I have the Norton Critical Edition, and I will reference some of the material in it.
Very good. And Uber, partly he didn't show up because he didn't pick a book this week, and hopefully he will have a book for next week. But do you want to go first, or do you think I should go first?
Go ahead, sir.
Okay, well, Julius Evola was a very prominent writer and thinker, of course, during Mussolini's fascist Italy in the 1930s and 40s. And to get a bit of context for this book, this is one of his later... It's not really a book so much as it is a collection of his essays in a fascist magazine that was published. He gave many talks and lectures before the fascists and National Socialists, and you can even see that in many of his essays in here. He openly, it's not so much a denunciation of the Italian fascism, but to semi-quote him, he kind of saw the Italian fascism as not a failure, as I'm keep bringing up, but just kind of as a disappointment. He saw the changes with the Italian fascist system as a superficial change. It was, as he puts it, it's bringing up back the aesthetic and not so much the tradition of tradition, but rather the superficialities of tradition. In a sense, it would be resurrecting the Roman Empire by having everyone wear togas and casting things with the traditional casting your buildings out of marble rather than the common materials. It's only an aesthetic change, not really an actual core fundamental change. The two primary aspects of this book that are so important and interesting for us on the nationalist side to actually read into is first is his kind of categorical explanation of this right-wing traditionalist society. Now he was among the people of National Socialist Germany and Italy who kind of looked for roots of this white identity, this pan-European European identity in the both Persian and also the northern Indian culture. He actually looks at human civilization, white European civilization, as broken down by the European caste system, actually. And it's not specific, not European caste, an Indian caste system, and I'm talking about from India, actually. But it's not strictly to it, but it basically goes like this. At the very top are the Brahmin, they're the spiritual leaders of the society. Under that you have the kings, the knights, the noblemen, and under that you have the mercantile class and the people who produce and sell, and under that you have, as he puts it, the slave caste. You have the people who have nothing to give and offer society but their raw labor. He brings up, I wish that we could banish this out of right-wing thought, but he does buy into, and it kind of fits into, I'll explain it in a little bit, he inputs the idea of proletariat and bourgeoisie into this caste system, kind of putting the mercantile class as the bourgeoisie and the slave class as the proletariat. This is why, in his mind, Marxism is, it's not so much antithetical to nationalism, but it's kind of a devolving of humanity. He frames it as when proper traditional civilization devolved from being led by this class of priests, it devolved first into he puts it as a secular society, as honor being the source of primary morality. These kings and queens, these people who they go and they fight for such values as the sovereignty of the king and the nobility of the aristocrats and things like that. When society devolved further, it devolved into this mercantile class of this bourgeoisie, anti-nationalist, globalist system in which the mercantile class are only concerned with things of profit. They care nothing for tradition. They care nothing for the spiritual backing of the original system, and also with these other slightly higher caste values such as honor and, sacredness of the king and other such things like that. And he puts Marxism as coming from the very lowest rung of this European civilization, the slave system. He says it's materialist. All that the slaves can offer is their labor and their time. Thus, all they seek is to gain the value from their labor and their time. They are unable to perceive the worth and the value of these upper systems. He also kind of gives a little, nod of approval towards fascist thought by putting this idea forward of class cooperation, saying that all the classes are indeed necessary. We don't want to, have the king and the priest class just completely genocide the slave caste and such. He says they're all necessary, so he gives a little wink towards fascism's principle of class cooperation and that, but he goes into the prime idea of this book, which is achieving the heroic death, the honorable sacrifice. He's kind of saying, to go back to tradition, we need to both reject the proletariat Marxism and the bourgeoisie mercantile globalism, and we need to go back up into this into this kind of secular. It's a semi-secular state because some of the values include the sovereignty of the king by divine right, but it lacks kind of like the duty-based transcendental ethics that comes with the priest class. Or I don't know why I'm saying class for the two most upper ones. They're caste.
Ah, they're close.
Yeah, I know, caste and class. They're pretty much the same, and I hate the idea of economic class, but it's integral to his explanation, and I think it's somewhat relevant. But again, I wish we could just purge the ideas of bourgeoisie and proletariat from nationalist thought. But again, if it's interbaked, then there's nothing we can do. But in order to achieve this, funnily enough, and this, I'm going to go into a side tangent on this, but a few of the things he references is, he says the reason for the Crusades, it wasn't so much a religious or political warfare. He says it was kind of a despite of rather than a because of. He says that the Crusades were in fact a reigniting of this need for a heroic death, for giving something that is greater to yourself for your race. He says that it was not because of Christianity, it was despite of it. It just reignited this European spirit of this idea that there is a holy land, there's a heaven, and by fighting to achieve this holy land, you kind of awaken yourself. Now, on this little tangent that I mentioned, he also, funnily enough, praises jihadis. He makes the distinction, however, that the people who suicide attack civilians, everything, is not an honorable system, and he goes into a little bit of Islamic history going against this, saying that and he uses only one hadith to support this, but he references a hadith where basically Muhammad was coming back from jihading, fighting non-believers in the name of Allah, and Muhammad says, I have come back from the lesser war to the greater war, and the Muslims ask, what is this greater war? And he says, the jihad within the spirit. And this is a huge kind of problem with Islam, because that's why I hate table talks too. Islam is willing to lie to anyone in order to get itself across as what they want. For Hitler and Ebola, it said, yes, we have a warrior spirit. We don't condone mindless slaughter. We have an inner metaphysical jihad that we work to conquer ourselves and things like that. While at the same time, now in the West and in Europe, it says Islam is a religion of peace. It preaches tolerance to everyone and is absolutely peaceful to all groups and all people. Obviously, both of these can't be true, and that's kind of... I don't fault Ebola for that, because I think at the time there wasn't much access to Islamic theology and everything like that, just kind of these general notions. He also... Going back to the original point, he also references Norse mythology very frequently, this concept of Valhalla, that the greatest champions reach Valhalla by fighting and dying in battle, not just dying in battle. And he makes a very distinct point about this, that achieving the heroic death is not... And he also is, funnily enough, within there, he also gives his own book review of All Quiet on the Western Front. And he goes into it, and he says, yes, to them, war may seem terrible because they have gone into war in the wrong frame of mind, and because of this, they didn't evolve into achieving a transcendental state. They didn't become a calm, cool, collected person knowing and controlling his mind and body in this very specific way. They instead devolved merely into animals and beasts. They're merely going in order to protect themselves in a very physical sense, and they're protecting others for the same reason of protecting their physical selves and their lives. So what Evola is really arguing for in this book is he wants to reverse this decline. He sees the fall at the end of World War One. We saw this fall of the monarchies and everything like that, and he sees this as a fall from the noble class. The fall from the priestly class happened much earlier in European civilization, but he sees this as the fall of the secular nobleman class, and at the time and now, it's arguable how far we are into the proletarian ideology of Marxism, but he says now we're in a very globalist, a very mercantile kind of form of ideology governing our society, and he says to reverse this, instead of going and devolving into this very beastly proletarian slave ideology of the only things that are worthwhile are time and labor and such, and we need to instead go... He doesn't openly... I'm not sure if he actually openly advocates going to war for the sake of war so much, and the sake of war being defined as getting material aims like such as he doesn't advocate, I wouldn't think he would advocate Europe going to war with, say, Turkey to conquer land or anything like that. But again, it's going to war for this idea of boosting yourself to a higher plane of metaphysical existence, as he puts it, of achieving this heroic death, of being controlling of your own spirit and your own principles and enforcing that spirit. And of course, I definitely recommend this. I also recommend Men Amongst the Ruins and all of his other books and everything like that. But Metaphysics of War, I would say, even if you haven't read any of Evola's work, I think it's very easy to get into and also very easy to understand. Unlike Nietzsche, he doesn't use overly poetic language. He writes it very much as since this was the method he was conveying it to people, as just weekly articles in a magazine, being no more than a few pages long for each essay, and it containing about, I would say maybe 2 or 3 dozen essays. It's very easy to get into, even if you haven't read all of this. Of course, most of the books we read on this stream, we're going to assume is worthwhile reading. But I would say, if you have... I only read this in about a week, more like 6 days. If you have time just to pick this up, I mean, it's no thicker than your finger. That, along with one of my favorite philosophical book, Grounding for the Metaphysics of Morals by Immanuel Kant. I mean, Kant's book was only 60 pages. His collection of essays is only about 139 pages, slightly longer, but Kant is a lot more dense to read, and this is a lot more acceptable. We can talk about the ideas in this book right after, but I would like to go into Thomas's review of his book. Go ahead.
Okay, so I read the seminal novel Heart of Darkness, which is interesting that you mentioned Nietzsche, because it is an exploration of Nietzschean themes set in a novel and from a very critical perspective. So, a little background on it. It was written by a man named Joseph Conrad. The setting of the book is in the Belgian Congo, which, I mean, I don't know if our listeners know this, but here's a little historical background. Late into the 19th century, Belgium took over the heart of Africa, the Congo River Basin, and started to explore the area for the resources that were there. A man named Livingston had recently trekked through the center of Africa. They knew that there was a bunch of ivory there, and so Europeans obviously moved in for colonial ventures. Now, the way that these colonial ventures are set up is the king sets up a corporation, essentially, that performs all of the activities there within that colony, quote-unquote. It's not like a state or directly administered by the state of the Belgian government. Instead, there's a company that hires people to go into the Congo to extract the things that they want, which are mostly mahogany and ivory, both very popular at the time. So, the book is about an Englishman who just so happens to get a job with this Belgian company. His name is Marlowe. And he's a boat captain, steamboat captain, very complicated stuff. Not a lot of people are great at that. And he's used to seafaring, but as it so happens, he ends up going up the Congo River. And his goal in going up the Congo River, the job he's actually been assigned to do, is find a man named Kurtz. Now, this man named Kurtz apparently has gone off the rails, as you find out in the book. And without giving too much away, though I'm going to give away the plot anyway, basically, Kurtz goes nuts even though he's the company's most prized ivory collector. And because he's gone nuts and he's not sending any more ivory back, the company starts to get nervous, and they send Marlowe and group up the river to find out what's going on with Kurtz. As they proceed up the river, there's several vignettes in the novel, which is extremely well written, that are attempts to explain the absurdity of colonial life, but it also goes into this ruminant theme that goes on throughout the book, and the reason that it's called The Heart of Darkness, about areas that are totally undeveloped. The Congo River Basin at this time being totally undeveloped, untouched by civilization as it was known then. And so it is still, quote-unquote, wild to the Europeans, and, it's wild to the people who live there, too, because they're running around in loincloths, unless they end up getting enslaved by the Belgians to go hunt ivory. So, as he goes up this river, he goes from European developed areas where they have outposts, and even though the climate sucks and everything sucks, they do have these outposts there, and there's Europeans, to the point where there's only natives that he can see, and that at that point in the river is where he's supposed to meet up with Kurtz. When he gets to the area where Kurtz's station is supposed to be, where all this ivory is flowing from the center of the continent out into, European hands to then get distributed around the continent for various purposes, like piano keys, he finds that Kurtz has actually gone native. Now, earlier he had found a manuscript Kurtz had written about how the natives were essentially humans and blah, blah, blah. And then over it, Kurtz had scribbled in just like manic ink, had written, "Exterminate all the brutes." So when Marlowe arrives, he's expecting to see that Kurtz has been either killed by all of these natives and trying to kill them, or that he's just killed them all and something's happened. He arrives there and finds instead that, like I said, this guy's gone wild. He's gone native. He has essentially created a system, a hierarchy, a caste system almost, amongst the natives, in which he's at the head, and they worship him like this bizarre white-skinned god that has come in from the coast to, bring their world upwards. And in that process, he's experimented with these Nietzschean kind of themes of being this, Ubermensch, this person who is above morality. He is ascended above the morality of Europe at the time. And because of that, he can set up this society in which all of these people are basically his slaves, doing for him what it is that he is sent there to do. But in that process, he loses himself. He loses himself to the power. And then he gets sick with malaria. And that's Kurtz. They drag him out of there. He's, he goes willingly. It's not like the movie, which you've all seen, Apocalypse Now, where he's like not willing to leave. Kurtz gets on the boat. As they go back, Kurtz dies of malaria. So Kurtz is dead, and right as he's about to die, he looks at Marlowe and he exclaims, "The whore! The whore!" Which is like, the line in the book everyone's heard before. You've heard that line in the movie too. But what this is suggestive of, and what it's suggestive of, couched within the themes of the book, is actually not, the horror of what I've done personally, but just like the horror of this whole experience. The reason he's yelling "exterminate all the brutes" on his piece of paper is because as he's going native, as he's becoming like these people, or just like ascending his morality to the point where he just loses touch with reality, he becomes disenchanted with their lifestyle, the same way that he becomes disenchanted with the way that the Europeans are. He kind of grows into this weird middle ground, a foot in one world and a foot in the other, and eventually he belongs in neither of them anymore. And so the book does ruminate on a lot of different themes, and it's extremely worth the read because it's very well put together. It is a Victorian novel, so it is on the dense side, but if you're listening to this, you probably don't have too much issue with density. Really great kind of vignettes into the way that the colonial system worked at this time, which you wouldn't necessarily get from other work. It was written to be critical of the colonial system, so you do see like that kind of naked dark side of it. But at the same time, the biggest theme in the book, this reoccurring theme of, the Congo, this undeveloped wild land, finally being touched by civilization, and sort of like the beginnings of the modernization of this area, which to this day is an ongoing process. This area is still afflicted with terrible violence. The Democratic Republic of the Congo today, as I'm sure anyone who watches the news knows, is not a nice place to be. These people still kill each other off in huge numbers, even though there's no more whites there. So we can't really always blame the whites for this kind of stuff. Just saying.
Rest in peace, Rhodesia.
Yeah, oh man, that poor country. But yeah, it's an interesting book. It's worth the read. You have to take a lot of it with a grain of salt. And Marlowe is a representative of Conrad, who is looking. Conrad himself was the son of a Russian conscript in Poland who left and became an Englishman so that he didn't have to get conscripted into the Russian army in Poland when he came of age, because it was generational. And so he's very critical of empire. Nonetheless, you do see that there are some kind of shining gems of empire. As absurd as Conrad makes it out to be in the book, there are things like the civilizing of these people, or like these people not living basically in malaria-infested hellholes, but actually being given the option of doing other things, of seeing more of the world, of having their mindset expanded over time. Very interesting. Also in the Norton Critical Edition, there are some very, very good first-hand accounts written of the actual explorers, not just Livingstone, who you can actually read his book, and it's good too, but of like other people that were there. In particular, there's an account written by a British officer about when they seized the city of Benin, which today is a country, but originally was like a city-state on the western coast of Africa. And he describes the situation that the British see when they arrive, which is a society that's set up in, it's almost like the Aztecs, where they sacrifice people. Voodoo comes actually from their language. It was a reference to kind of their Tolmetic religious system that they had set up in the city of Benin. And he describes like the absolute horror him and his men feel when they see all what to them is like this despicable, unrealistic religion, and the way that they sacrifice human beings, especially children, in order to make the Mutu medicine that they use, which is like potions and various things that are supposed to have effects, that beneficial effects. Very interesting first-hand account. There's also accounts of what the Congo was like originally. That comes from Livingstone as well as other people. Livingstone was an American, by the way, talking about nationalism. Good old American hiking through the bush in the Congo. We've got speeches about what was going on in these cities, in African cities at this time, in the native African cities. And the big lesson that you learn from all of this material, and I do not think the publisher's intention was to kind of impart this on the reader, but absolutely Africa is the same that it has always been. Clearly, even without Europeans there, these people were doing very horrible things to one another, and doing so in a way that was kind of justified by their worldview, so they didn't really think anything of it. They didn't have like the moral compass that apparently developed in Eurasian societies, where we think like killing kids so that your dick works is probably a bad idea. Well, then again, there is China, which kills rhinos so that their dicks work, but I digress.
And here in the West, we have stem cells, which make your dicks and spines work.
Yeah, wow, crazy. And we have this thing called Viagra. Nothing gets hurt when we make it. It's nuts. All very good. It's also good, I think, to reevaluate like the literature you read as a kid that talks about how evil colonialism is, because there are a lot of aspects of colonialism that aren't really mentioned in the critical, like, attack colonialism literature that we all grew up reading, the myth that we grew up understanding, that we were taught about how the world works. There are aspects of colonialism that are very interesting to point out. Like, as this book points out, if it was not for the Romans invading the native Celtic tribes of the Britannic Islands, Britain, I should say, would still to this day be a wild, quote-unquote, zone. That it was empire that brought the light of civilization to these places initially, and that kind of process unfolded across Europe, and most of the big European countries were actually just a bunch of savages running around when the Romans started invading initially with their legions. There's also the aspect of empire that's really interesting, especially 19th century empires, which was their kind of like macroeconomic effects. So people in Europe really want ivory so that they can make pianos. And there's lots of people who can buy pianos at this time period that want to buy pianos. And they also want mahogany furniture. Therefore, this Belgian company goes to Africa and uses this land almost exclusively to pull out these two resources that it is looking for. In the process, in order to just make its own people comfortable, it has to start this settling process where they start building cities, where they start creating the supply networks, utilizing the rivers so that they can move supplies up and down into the interior of the continent. There's also this whole process, and the macroeconomic development of the Congo would not have occurred if there weren't Europeans who are willing to sit there all day and carve piano keys out of elephant tusk. Which is also, it's another aspect of colonialism that's not mentioned in this book in particular, but another interesting one for the listeners to think about is the effect that British colonialism had on India. Related theme, so I'm just going to digress into this. Had it not been for the British taking over India in various ways, they had both areas they directly administered as well as princely states that were administered by the princes themselves, who then answered to the Queen. In theory, really, it was the British East India Company up until the British Raj was formed, in which the state began to directly administer it. The effect of all of that not only was the development of India, which today is turning into a world superpower, and so clearly it's had a great amount of benefit from having European technology brought, but also the religious effect. So in a lot of the northern Indian states, the prince would be a Muslim, and he would tolerate the fact that there were Hindus in his state because they would have to pay taxes. And those taxes would be used by a lot of the princes to, fatten up their war chests. It would be for the luxuries that they wanted, as well as so that they continue to gain power, utilizing this extra money that they had from the thousands upon thousands of Hindus that were obliged to pay this tax. However, occasionally one prince would come into power, and he would be totally intolerant of Hinduism because it's not one of the quote-unquote accepted faiths of Islam, but honestly, Islam doesn't accept anything but itself and only its narrow interpretation of itself. And so the states would eventually be converted from Hinduism to Islam through this process of randomly getting that super pious prince who would then rule that kingdom and convert everyone. And so it is arguable that given another 100, 200 years, even larger chunks of India would not be Hindu anymore, but would be Muslim, and the Muslim world would be much larger because of it. An example is the state of Bengal, traditionally a Hindu holy land. It's at where the Ganges River meets the Indian Ocean. That delta is extremely significant in Hinduism, and the area that is today the state of Bengal, not the state of West Bengal, which is a part of India, but Bengal itself is mostly Muslim. Simply because over the course of time, like I said, some prince got in there. He said, no, I'm not going to tolerate any of you Hindus anymore. You better convert or I'm going to kill you. And so it's just interesting to note that colonialism also kind of stopped up some of the leaks in which Islam was leaking into the third world. Now, arguably, would that have changed, the world's history? Probably to some degree. It wouldn't be huge for Europeans, but it is interesting to note colonialism has a lot of effects other than just being evil whites being bad. All right, let's move on. You have anything to say about that, Cole?
Yes. Actually, I should have put it online, but if many people are unfamiliar with my writing style, it's often I will write something on a physical piece of paper in a notebook, and I have multiple notebooks of this, and they just kind of sit there until the topic either becomes relevant or I feel inspired to actually either expound or to copy them online. But for a while, I was kind of into this. I was kind of into a I don't even really know how to put it. It was somewhat dialectic, but not exactly the Hegelian dialectic. But the idea of these essays I wrote was on this position of what is the ideal form of colonialism and imperialism. And basically, I use these kind of graphs to kind of illustrate the point. I broke it down in first two different categories of how it can be done. Now, the idea behind colonialism is to get these resources and other things from these various tribes or these other non I don't even really, how can I put this? non-in-group people, these foreign people, as it were. So what were the two terms I used? I used two different terms that were basically amounted to creating organic growth and imposing growth, like artificially imposing institutions that would have resulted in organic growth. Basically, and the example I gave was cell phones and cell phone towers. So if you're colonizing some, foreign people, if you go in and you almost enslave them, but you basically build cell phone towers, you give every single one a cell phone, yes, your temporary gains are increased because the productivity of said foreign people are increased. However, over time, as this is the inevitable course of colonial civilization, the people that are being, controlled by this foreign state are going to become more and more dissatisfied. They're going to become more and more rebellious, as it were, demanding, if not fair rights, just in a general sense, demanding better things, demanding better compensation for this, and thus it's an inevitable case that either the empire collapses in the case of kind of Britain, where it all the people from these former colonies are able to re-immigrate to the British Isles, or it's the case that the colonializer just pulls out altogether and says you're on your own. And I think that was the case for I believe Spain for the most part. I believe that's true mostly for Spain, for the places they colonized. They came in and conquered and pulled out as soon as they got, basically got their fill from the resources. But it's this basic idea that is brought up, and I wish I could remember his name, but it was a great philanthropist that worked in Africa, and he gave this great quote that when you're in Africa and dealing with African peoples, you cannot consider yourself equal to them. You must consider yourself to be a teacher or a mentor. If you consider yourself equal to them, they will either destroy everything you create or you will just be devoured by them. Similar to in your book Heart of Darkness, of being integrated into their people. But with this colonial idea, I put forth this idea that you have to, if you want, I originally postulated that colonialism was kind of a bad idea because of very ethno-nationalist means. We don't want to involve other people in our societies for risk of, kind of getting this reverse immigration where the people of the colonies are getting better access to your own country. But I said, if you do want to colonialize a people, it's best to go in there and try to develop their civilization naturally so it doesn't accelerate this process of them rejecting the colonial rule and causing more problems for that. And I also drew a general graph and outline of the it was basically a ratio or comparison. Sorry about that snap. I'm fiddling with something while I talk. But but it was a general comparison of people's desire to get this either it could be more representation, it could be just more material wealth, it could be more access to these technologies or perceived cushy lives of these aristocrats ruling over them, compared to how much resources you're able to get by developing this country. And it was basically, even before you reach your peak, you want to pull out before you reach your peak, because at that specific peak, from there, it's all going to decline downhill of the people saying, we want you to give us more, and that demand of appeasing them without causing revolution is less valuable than the resources you're extracting from them. Now, I know you made the argument that colonialism was a good thing because it benefited India and all these other African countries, but do you agree with that general sentiment?
I don't intend for anyone to think that I think colonialism is a good thing per se. colonialism, like everything else, it has its upsides, it has its downsides. I mean, that's a very interesting way to look at it, is like using those two dynamics as the various axes for a graph. I mean, there's also other things that go into colonialism. You've got manpower expended on it. There's a lot of things that, especially in our modern community today, isn't necessarily a good idea or something that I would advocate for. But yeah, I do agree with those general sentiments that, yeah, there is a point at which there's only so much you can pull out of a country before it's just unreasonable for you. And the Belgians reached that in 1965, and they pulled out in a hurry.
And funnily enough, I believe this was the Belgian colonies. Didn't they offer a reward for thieves, or was it rebels, their left hands or so, and so it ended up creating a market where people are just cutting off people's left hands to sell them to the Belgians?
I don't remember exactly what the cause was, but yeah, that is an interesting parable about the Belgian colonies, especially in Africa.
And a similar thing was also referenced in one of my economic courses. I got my degree in political science, but my minor was in economics. And
Yeah,
in
same here.
discussing, markets, it was either in one of my economics classes or in a class involving just bureaucracy and the American bureaucracy, like studying its structure and infrastructure. But it basically tells a story, and I believe it was the Belgians again, or it might have been the French. Basically, there was a huge rat problem in one of their colonies, so they offered to pay Africans, people, the idea was, we pay you a little bit of money for every single dead rat you bring us. So funnily enough, it created a market of people exploiting that, where you would have rat breeders. The African people were breeding rats together in order to, bring back massive amounts of dead rats to the Belgians. And that's another funny little thing with colonialism. And if you want to see, as I mentioned before, this idea of the people who pulled out of the colonies, on my channel, which is Colcol, Colcoal, one of my first videos is a translation of a great Italian film called Africa Audio. The English version it has been put as a kind of butchery because it's called Africa Blood and Guts, and it paints the colonial powers leaving as a revolution that is bloody but overall good. But Africa Audio, it paints a much different picture. It almost just shows the collapse of society and civility in general when these colonial powers pulled out. When the British pulled out in this particular colony, it shows just absolute devastation. All the former wildlife preserves that were there, they were immediately hunted to, not extinction of the species, but almost to just extinction in that local area. There was massive amounts of poaching, massive amounts of, oh crap, what was that terrorist organization called? It wasn't ANC, but it was the Mau Mau.
Oof.
That was it.
Oh.
The Mau Mau,
Oh.
it showed all the prisoners being released that were Mau Mau, calling them heroes of the people and everything like that, and just a massive amounts of killing of the Boers and all these terrible things. But again, it's called Africa Audio, and it's on my channel. You can watch it for free with English subtitles, and I recommend
Sounds good.
I recommend that. But
Well, I think that's another instructive aspect of colonialism, too, is that it really points out, especially in its formation and then in the time that the European powers were no longer able to sustain it, it points out the differences between the Europeans and the society they built and the Africans and the kind of the natural society that they go to when they don't have that, like, European overlord, quote-unquote. And it is instructive of the differences that do exist between these two groups in particular. I think that's a stark example, but you could see it almost anywhere that was a former colony.
That's true, and back then, when I wasn't so explicitly ethno-nationalist in my essays, I would have attributed that to imposed growth rather than organic growth. I would have said that these institutions that were forced on the African people only bred resentment to these specific institutions, and thus, when those institutions are no longer enforced, you get the bloody uprising and dismantling of these institutions, compared to, say, the Indian people that while they still had stuff enforced on them, these institutions, for the most part, did have some kind of organic effect, because it's not so much that they were created organically, it's that they... I don't really even know how to put this. It was that they were more agreeable to the Indian people, thus the Indian people were able to build upon the institutions themselves. A very good
Right.
a very good parable of this is it's not so much a parable, but an actual story based on a quote of this British general, that it was a practice of the of I don't know if it was a specific sect, but just Hindus in India, whenever a husband would die, it was customary at the time to burn the widow in the funeral pyre along with the husband. And
Right.
so when this British general came and saw this, he was absolutely horrified, and he put into place a law saying anyone who burns women alive are going to be hung from a tree, and the Indians said, you can't do this. It's, it's our religious right. We believe it's right. And he said, all right, fine, that's your culture. You can do what your culture says, but my culture says whenever someone burns an innocent woman alive, that person is to be hung from a tree. And eventually that practice, is no longer around. At least I don't
Right.
believe it's any longer around in India. So, again, this point is that with colonialism, imposing institutions is going to result in it's going to result in a lot of bloodshed. And whether you put this idea that we brought hospitals, we brought extensive care for them, we got resources out of it, the manner in which you go about forcing the time in which you are able to extract these resources, how fast you're able to get as many resources as possible, determines the long-term effectiveness of these institutions actually taking root and not being just absolutely rejected in a bloody revolution.